Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Ruth. It's kind of interesting. It's just purely coincidental that as this sermon series has progressed, we've kind of walked our way through some of the history in the Old Testament. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Abraham and Sarah, remember, coming from Ur, where they were from, into the Promised Land, Canaan. And then last week, we talked about the Exodus. Abraham and Sarah had generations later, their descendants had left and gone to Egypt, and then generations after that, they had left Egypt through the leadership of Moses and come back to the Promised Land. And today, the story of Ruth takes place after that time, after the Exodus, as the people have returned to their land in Canaan, to the Promised Land. And Ruth is a Moabite woman who marries into the family of Naomi. And prior to this reading from the 6th to 16th verses of the first chapter, Naomi's sons, including Ruth's husband, have died. Naomi has made a decision that she's going to be returning home to Israel, to Judah, and Ruth has to decide what she's going to do. Does she stay where she's from, or does she follow her mother-in-law Naomi to her land? And so hear these words. She, being Naomi, she left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her. They went along the road to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back, each of you, to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you, just as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord provide for you, so that you may find security, each woman in the household of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. But they replied to her, "No, instead, we will return with you to your people." Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there again be sons in my womb that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, go. I am too old for a husband, and if I were to say that I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you refrain from having a husband?" I'm going to interrupt myself for a moment to remind you that in the society at that time, it's not the way it ought to be, but a woman's value came from her husband. And in society at that time, there was something called levirate marriage that basically meant if your husband died, then you had to marry your husband's brother or closest. Aren't you glad that rule doesn't exist anymore? And so what she's talking about is that Ruth, the daughters-in-law, would have to wait until Naomi's new children were born and grew up and marry them before she could marry anybody else. So she says, "No, my daughters, this is more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And so Naomi and Ruth in the book of Ruth are hoping to find that home that they longed for. Naomi had been there and had left her people, the Israelites, gone to Moab and with a husband, and had come back now. As the story begins of Ruth, what happens before today's scripture reading is that Naomi's sons, who she's traveled with, along with their wives, Naomi's sons die. And so Naomi decides to return to her native land, to return to Judah. And the daughters-in-law of Naomi have a decision that they have to make, including Ruth, about whether to also return with Naomi back to Naomi's homeland, which is not their homeland. That's not where they're from. They're from Moab. They're Moabites. And so do they return back home with Naomi to her home, which is not their own? Or do they stay in Moab and in the context of that time, stay there so that they can find another husband so that they can be married, because for a woman who's not married, there's tremendous insecurity. And so the choice is obvious, to stay where they were. And that's what all but one decides to do. But Ruth decides to go with her mother-in-law and to stay with her for Naomi to become her home and to go with Naomi back to Judah. Now, whether or not Ruth tells real history is debated, but it does take place in a real time. It does take place in a real historical time and in a real historical place. And so I want to do a brief bit of history with you, some biblical history, so that we can see the context in which this happens, because this is important. The Old Testament could be divided into three major historical markers. The first one being the Exodus, which, of course, remember, brought the Israelites from Egypt back into the Promised Land, where it wasn't designed this way, but we've kind of followed the history of Israel in this sermon series so far, this being week 3. We started with Abraham going from Ur to Canaan, and that's the Promised Land. And then the people last week, they left the Promised Land, they went to Egypt, remember, and last week we talked about the Exodus some. So the Exodus happens between 1500 and 1300 BC, most likely, historically, would be when the Exodus happens. And so the Exodus brings the people back from Egypt, back to the Promised Land, where Abraham had been so many years before. And they lived there under the guidance of judges, not kings, but judges in a kind of a confederation of tribes, until about 1000 BC, when first Saul and then David become kings of Israel. That's a time called the United Monarchy, because there was one king over all of the Israelites. And then Ruth takes place now between those two periods, before the time of David and the kings, after the time of the Exodus. So it takes place in that time of the judges. Maybe 1100 or so BC, we're told in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, we're told that Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. David was king in 1000. So we'll say about 1100 BC is when this would take place, the last part of the period of the judges. All right, so that's the first couple of markers, the Exodus and King David. The third marker is in 587 BC. Up until that point, from roughly 1300 BC to 587 BC, Israel was, to some degree, at least, an independent and free nation. But in 587, the Babylonians come in and finish conquering, actually, it started a decade earlier, finish conquering the land of Israel, and Israel then remains captive of Babylon for roughly 50 years, until 539 BC. And it's called the Babylonian exile, or the Babylonian captivity. But you can think about it as another exile. People were forcibly taken from Israel to Babylon, resettled there, and integrated into that society for not quite 50 years. Roughly 50 years. For some of them more than that, for some of them a little bit less than that. And this is the period of time then when 50 years later, 539, when the people started to be resettled back into Israel after that exile period ended, that's when the story of Ruth probably was written. Okay, so I want to make sure that you hear this again. The events of Ruth take place in roughly 1100 BC, during the time of the judges. Israel's become an independent nation. They have freedom for the first time in hundreds of years. And so that's when it takes place. It was written maybe 600 years later, shortly after the exile, the Babylonian exile ended, and the people were reestablishing themselves as an independent, more or less independent nation. You got that? That's important. Because here's something else that you need to know. At about the same time that Ruth was written, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were also written. Ezra and Nehemiah they're two different books in the Bible, but they really go together. Ezra and Nehemiah are two people that hang out together, and it's really kind of like part 1 and part 2 of the story of what happened after the exile. So the people of Israel have started to return back home. There was a few remnants that were still there, And so they start to rebuild the temple, they start to rebuild the walls. Ezra and Nehemiah tell that story. And there's commandments in those books that were used actually as late as the 1960s, and probably in some places still today, to argue against interracial marriage, for example. Because as Ezra and Nehemiah were written, the primary concern that they had was, how do we maintain the unity of culture, the unity of the society that we're trying to rebuild? How do we make sure that we are true to being who it is that God wants us to be? And part of the solution that they came up with was, well, we maintain the integrity of the group. Integrity not meaning like ethical integrity, but meaning the common bonds. We maintain the common bonds as much as we can, as tightly as we can. And so if people from outside come inside, that could threaten the integrity. They bring their own culture with them, they bring their own ideas with them, and if those ideas get assimilated into our ideas, then we start to lose our unity. So, for example, in the 10th chapter of Ezra, we hear this. Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have been unfaithful by marrying foreign women and adding to Israel's guilt. But now make a confession to the Lord God of your ancestors and do his will. Separate yourselves from the neighboring peoples and from the foreign wives." And although, for example, the Bible tells us pretty consistently that divorce is really not God's ideal, in this case, they say, if you've married somebody who's from wherever, you should send them home and purify, for lack of a better word, purify again the Israelites. So that's the approach that Ezra and Nehemiah take. Ruth, remember, written pretty much at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, those books would have been written contemporaneous to the events that happened in those books. So Ruth is written at about the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's not what happens in Ruth, in the book. Remember, Ruth is an outsider. And Ruth wants to be adopted into the family and into the nation, into the family of Naomi and into, therefore, the nation of Naomi, the Israelites. Your people will be my people, she says. She wants to stay faithful to her mother-in-law, and she wants to be part of the family and part of the nation. And as the story continues, we find that she does become part of the family. She does become part of the nation. She literally becomes part of the family as she eventually marries into the family. And Ruth's becoming part of Israel becomes so significant in the understanding of who Israel is that she's included, as I mentioned, in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. She's included in that. Genealogies back then, you don't talk about the women in the genealogy. You talk about the men. So-and-so is the son of so-and-so who's the son of so-and-so. In Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, there's only 3 women that are mentioned. It's remarkable that any women are mentioned, but there's 3 that are mentioned, and Ruth is one of those 3. It becomes a part of Israel's story. You hear this. Ezra and Nehemiah and Ruth give us 2 very different paths when it comes to how we treat outsiders, for lack of a better word. But it's not really that one's entirely right and one's entirely wrong. They have different kinds of priorities. Ezra's concerned about rebuilding a nation. And in the rebuilding of the nation, he's concerned about identity. Who are we as a people? And so understanding and maintaining the culture and identity of Israel as a people of God is foremost on his mind. That's not a bad thing. Making sure that we maintain identity, making sure that we maintain our understanding of who we are, that's not a bad thing. The author of Ruth, which remember was written about the same time, the author of Ruth has a different concern. Ruth is concerned about what happens to those outside of Israel who inevitably, for whatever reason, are going to become part of the nation. And in the case of the time that Ruth takes place, for example, remember the Babylonian exile. For more than a generation, people were living in Babylon. They were outside of Israel. for more than a generation. And so that means you've got children who are growing up next to children from Babylon. You cannot help but have them become friends. You cannot help but have them form relationships. And you don't know that you're ever going to return back to Israel, so why would you not approve of a marriage between the two? So you cannot help but have that coming together of two different cultures. And so that's a real issue then when the people start to move back to the geography of Israel. There is that intermingling. And even into the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, then, as the people, or I'm sorry, that was the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, right before that. But in the original story with Ruth, the time frame that Ruth takes place in, I just told you about the time that it was written. And the time that it takes place, remember that during that time of the judges, Israel is still settling into the area. And so they're still conquering different cities, occupying different cities. And so again, you're going to have inevitably an intermingling of the cultures. And so Ruth is talking about a real life situation, both in the context of when it takes place and in the context of when it was written, about the intermingling of folks. And so we have to deal with the question of how do we handle those who are from outside of our culture, who want to, or who have no choice but to, become a part of the culture. Here, those are just, it's not that one's right and what's wrong. It's different priorities, both of which somehow have to be dealt with. I'd argue it's not entirely unlike our national politics right now. Donald Trump wants to make America great again, right? And we can talk about the semantics, we can talk about the methodology, certainly, but who doesn't want America to be great? I want America to be great, don't you? That's a good idea. Now, a centerpiece of his campaign is tighter immigration policies. And again, we can debate how tight those policies ought to be. We can debate how do we handle those who are already here in the United States. But I don't know of anybody who's calling for a completely, entirely open border where literally anybody who wants to come into the United States and become a part of the United States can just simply walk across and there you are. That's not what anybody's talking about. The debate is about how controlled do we have the border, not whether or not there should be any control over the border, right? There's people who are deported every day. That's the Ezra part. Maintaining our identity as Americans, that's the Ezra part. And that's part of what it means to be a country. Then there's the other side. We also need to be gracious and hospitable to those who enter the country. And again, there are very few people who would say that we shouldn't be somehow hospitable and gracious. Now, exactly what that looks like, that's going to differ from party to party and person to person. But there's very few people who would completely disagree with the idea that we should have no, there's very few people who would say that we should have no concern for the humanity, the basic humanity of the people who are involved. The question is how many people can be integrated into our society at a time, and how do we do that? How do we help to integrate them? And how many do we need to not integrate, but rather send back home? So do you hear Ruth in this? How do we integrate people into the society who in some cases are already here, in other cases want to be here? See, we, like the Israelites of the 6th century BC, we live in this tension of maintaining the integrity of who we are as a country, maintaining the integrity of who we are as a culture, and at the same time welcoming people in who want to be here or who need to be here for safety. It's a tension that we live in. All right, that may make you a little bit uncomfortable. I'm going to make you more uncomfortable now, because I want to suggest to you that at St. Paul's, we live in that exact same tension. We live in that exact same tension here. I've been on church staff in some capacity at 8 different churches over the course of the last 22 years, more than half of my life. That's crazy, by the way. I realized yesterday that it's more than half of my life that I've been on a church staff. Over that time, I've also visited probably 24 churches with the part of the intent being to see how they do things well. What do they do well? What do they do not as well? What would perhaps the church that I'm serving at, what might we want to incorporate and what would we not want to incorporate? And so I've been intentionally thinking about what that church does, and part of that is the welcome that they give. And I want you to know that of those probably 30-plus churches that I've been to, that this church, St. Paul's, you do welcoming better than any church that I've ever seen. Those of you who have started to come here in the last 6 years since I've been here, you need to know that I got that welcome when I showed up at St. Paul's 6 years ago. That's not something that's new to the church over the last few years. That's something that is integral to who this church is, that goes all the way back. It's part of the DNA of this community of faith to welcome people, whoever they are, whatever brings them here. That's a way in which we're like the story of Ruth, right? We welcome people, we incorporate people into the family, and we incorporate people into St. Paul's, period. It doesn't matter who you are. We want to adopt people into the community of faith, just like Ruth is adopted into the nation of Israel and adopted into the family with Naomi. Yeah. Unlike Ruth, you don't have to marry into the family. If you come, you're welcome. It's like Ruth. At the same time, in any organization, when a new person comes through the doors, the way that things have been change. A family event is different when somebody brings a boyfriend or a girlfriend to it. If those people become married, become partners, that family changes forever. It's not good or bad, it just is, right? A nation changes when immigrants arrive, whether that nation is Israel or the United States. A nation changes when the immigrants arrive. And is there anyone who's been here at St. Paul's even more than 1 year, with a number of new people who will come as time goes on? Is there anybody who's been here even 1 year today who's willing to say that nothing has changed in who St. Paul's is over the last year? And certainly over the last 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, things change. The same people, this is what I want you to hear, the same people who we welcome into St. Paul's, some of you here this morning, the same people who we welcome into St. Paul's, whether it's a pastor or a staff person or a new member or somebody who doesn't join the church as a member but is a regular attender at the church, the same people who we welcome in also inevitably, just because they're a new person in this place, will create change at the church as St. Paul's, and we need to be aware of that. Just like Ezra, we want to stay true to our identity as a church, and just like Ruth, we want to welcome new people in. Do you hear the tension? And we experienced this in adopting our new mission statement. I think it was about 3 years ago that we adopted the statement of loving God and serving, and loving, seeking, and serving. And we had a team that contained a mixture of some longtime St. Paul's veterans, some people who were very new to the church, and everything in between. And together they developed this statement that they believed spoke to who St. Paul's is. They presented that to the congregation through focus groups, not unlike the groups that some of you were a part of over the last couple of weeks. They presented to the congregation in that way for feedback, and the feedback was really not good. And so the group came back together, and they said, all right, let's throw that out and start again. I don't remember what that statement was, but it's not the one we adopted. Because they threw it out, and they said, all right, we haven't done a good job of staying true to the core, to the DNA of who St. Paul's is. And so they went back to the drawing board. A couple months later, they came back with a new statement, the statement that we ultimately adopted: love God and all others unconditionally, seek answers to our questions, and serve God by serving others. And that was, instead of being rejected, that was virtually unanimously agreed to, virtually unanimously approved. And here's what I want you to hear. It was a new statement, but it was a new statement that said in a new way what this church has always been. It embraced both those who were new to the church and those who had been a part of the church since the very beginning. It embraced both the Ruths, who had newly been incorporated into the church, and it embraced the Ezras, who were concerned, rightfully concerned, about maintaining who St. Paul's has always been, the core of who we've always been. You've heard the saying, you can't come home again. And it's not true. Of course you can come home again. You can always come home again. Some of you have come home again. Some of you have been away from St. Paul's for a long time and have come back home. But it's not quite the same home, is it? It changes. It's different now than it was. Hopefully better in some ways, maybe not as good in other ways, certainly just different in some ways. Different in the same way as a family that has grown with a new child or a new relationship. Different in the same way as a nation that has incorporated immigrants, like the Irish 150 or so years ago, when literally half of Ireland immigrated to the United States. And they were not treated well at first, but ultimately became treated well and incorporated into the country. Different, like when Babylonians became of Israeli society. Those people who come, you who have come, bring tremendous gifts. And I am so grateful for each Ruth who has become part of this family. And I'm grateful for each Naomi who has brought a Ruth here. And I'm grateful for each Ezra who is committed to keeping the core of who we are as a church, our centeredness in the all-inclusive love of God through Jesus Christ. I'm grateful for the core of who St. Paul's is that the Ezras have helped to keep true while we become what God has called us to be. It takes all of us in all of those different roles to be the place, to be the church, to be the community that God calls us to be. So I'm so glad each one of you is here, that you are home. And I can't wait to see who else becomes a part of this community of faith, and I can't wait to see what we become as we continue to live out what God calls us to be and what God calls us to do.